And we begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And g'day. So good to see you, as today we look at another very well-known narrative. This time we are having a history lesson from the Old Testament, where at God's command, Abram packs up his bags and family and heads off to Canaan. But there is an interesting backstory that sadly we don't usually hear, as it isn't part of the lectionary reading, which is probably because at a quick glance it is just another boring genealogy that doesn't count in giving us a picture of the start of the Israelite nation. And when we are reading Genesis, we do tend to skip over the genealogy bits in our hurry to get to the exciting parts. But if God had Moses put in this prologue to Abram's biography, we can then be sure that there is stuff here that even us people of non-Jewish descent should know. For the genealogy not only sets up the reader with essential details about Abram's family that is needed to understand where they fit in during the rest of Genesis narratives, it also gives us a tidbit of prior information that helps give a different perspective to Abram's response to God's command. And so, as I read from chapter 11, verses 26 to 32, its portrayal of the family tree, try to pick up on a relevant piece of information that has been left out. This is the account of Terah. After Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Oh, just a quick side note. This does not mean that Terah had triplets, as some people have argued, for one would assume this unusual birth would be mentioned, when it wasn't much later that the idea of twins was considered abnormal, and people loved to debate about which son was born first, due to dating difficulties with New Testament verses mentioning the traditional belief of Abraham's age when God called him. But they are all chasing red herrings, for if who was Terah's eldest son was important information, that would have been in the narrative. What was considered important for the original Israelite audience was gaining an understanding of who's who in their family tree to help them know the history of how they became this great nation who was about to fulfill God's promises to Abram and enter the promised land. And so the genealogy continues by explaining Haran was the father of Lot, while his father Terah was still alive. Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. Abram's wife was Sarai, and Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Issachar. Did you notice how Nahor's wife has her father listed, Haran, and yet Lot and Milcah will both appear later on in the narrative? And perhaps as Lot is mentioned separate to his sisters, they are half-siblings, and having this piece of parental information, we have one of those wonderful mystery clues that Sherlock Holmes would have loved, for he would have picked up on the fact that Sarai's father isn't mentioned. Why is it not important to know who her father was at this stage of the narrative? And as anyone who has read all of Abram's biography knows, the answer is found much later in chapter 20. And as it is not relevant for today's verses, if you don't know, go and check it out later. Whereas in verse 30, Moses gives the reader pertinent information to help them understand the immediate ensuing narrative, as he states that Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. Nothing like a double emphasis to rub salt into the wound. For even today, where there are way more options to help you get pregnant, and yet sadly, there are still women who are unable to have a child of their own. And for the original audience, they understood that Sarai's barrenness meant that she was firstly experiencing God's judgment on Eve in Genesis 3:16, for they knew that the Hebrew wording says God had told Eve, I will intensify your labour to conceive, and you will bear children in pain. And so not only Abram and Sarai, but everyone around them would have been questioning, why has God deprived Sarai the privilege of having children? Was God judging her for some secret sin? And so Sarai would have felt this incredible sense of shame and worthlessness at not being able to have children. And amongst all that emotional turmoil portrayed in those few words, the narrative switches to a very basic, just the facts and nothing but the facts account in verse 31, where we learn Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, Haran's son, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And once again, we need to put our Sherlock Holmes detective hats and slow down and look, for surprisingly, there is an awful lot of information we miss in those few sentences. Firstly, the word translated took in Hebrew, among other things, gives this idea of to take away, carry away, to be taken from or out of, which kind of makes you wonder whether Abram, Sarai and Lot were totally on board with Terah's idea of leaving Ur to travel umpteen hundred kilometres to Canaan. They would have agreed that leaving the hot, dusty desert wasn't a bad idea. But surely there was places closer. And perhaps Terah grieving over having lost his son Haran, and so not wanting to be separated from his surviving sons, guilt trips them into joining him. Or Terah may have pulled out the parental authority card. And even today, there are many other cultures who understand how, even when you are married, you are still expected to obey your parents. And so Abram and co were obediently going with Terah, as their society expected of them. And secondly, did you notice where Terah set out for? Yes, Canaan, the promised land. And that makes it so frustrating. There are so many unanswered questions, like, why doesn't the Bible tell us how come Terah decided to set out for Canaan? Did Terah's grief over the death of Haran cause him to want to leave the place due to its constant reminder of his dead son? And yet it isn't mentioned, because otherwise people in the future would think that is the only way to grieve. For as people who have lost loved ones realize, everyone's response to grief is different. There are those who build mini shrines to their loved one, and others who can't bear the painful reminders and need to escape the pain, and others whose responses are somewhere in between them two. Whereas, or perhaps more likely, it may be the Terah who, as Joshua told the Israelites in chapter 24, verse 2, that long ago your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. And so Terah, like many modern people still discover during periods of grief, the idols they have created and been worshipping to give them a good life have failed them. And so in his grief, Terah thought about how his ancestors had talked about a different God to the gods he and his pagan neighbours worshipped. They had talked about knowing the God whose powerful word created the world and the universe. This God actually grieved so much over people's sinful way of living that he had commanded a flood, and yet, in compassion, had rescued Noah and his family. This God had made an everlasting promise to not flood the world again, and had given the rainbow as an everlasting sign that he meant what he said. And so Terah wanted to head off in search of someone who would know this God personally and be able to tell him more. For it sounded like this God was powerful enough and yet also compassionate enough to help him deal with his grief. Or then again, perhaps God personally spoke to Terah and told him to go to Canaan. And from my experience, I reckon it is a strong possibility it was a combination of all of the above. But the one thing we can be positive about is that Terah and his extended family packed up their belongings and set out for Canaan. And then comes a twist with verse 31, finishing with, but when they came to Haran, they settled there. Once again, the narrative raises so many unanswered questions, like what went wrong that we had the but? Was it, as some believe, that after months and months on the dry, dusty desert road, when they got to the green oasis of Haran, that they decided this was as good a place as any? They didn't want to spend more months travelling to discover that Canaan wasn't quite as good as it was here? Or perhaps Terah did like the gods of Haran and gave up on the God who created the world. And so a lot of people see Terah as the negative contrast to Abraham's obedience, giving people a strong warning against not obeying God or following other gods, because he doesn't get the attention Abraham does in the rest of the Bible. Personally, I struggle with that idea. After all, later on, and not that much later on, in Judges, there are lots of guys who do good things for God and the Israelites, and yet only get a paragraph or two written about them. And secondly, there is no warning about what happened to Terah like there normally is about a person's sins causing them problems in disobeying God. Therefore, I wonder whether it was something more matter of fact, like Terah got crook either on the way or shortly after arriving at Haran, and so he couldn't continue the journey. And as verse 32 explains, that Terah lived 205 years and then he died in Haran. And maybe the illness was the cause of his death, for there are many examples in my life and others of God asking you to do something, which you do, and then later on something happens that prevents you from continuing to do what God has asked you to do. Well, maybe not the death bit, seeing as we are still alive. For God now has other plans for you. And also, if God wants his initial plan to continue after he has moved you on, he will have someone else in mind to continue the work. And that is what we see in chapter 2, verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your relatives and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." Abram understood that as his father wasn't continuing the journey, God was passing the mantle on to him to take up the role of leading those willing to go with him to this land God will show him. That part would have made sense to him. But how did he feel about God's command to leave? Did Abram fully comprehend all that God was asking of him? And did Abram feel prepared for the task? Was Abram feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility? So many other unanswered questions to help us know where Abram's thinking was at. Again, God would have had Moses leave it out so that we could think maybe how nervous or worried I am feeling about what God is asking me to do is how Abram felt at God's command to leave the beauty of Haran and the security of family to go to Canaan. And then we hear something we have probably heard heaps of times before, but please do stop and think about how God is making this unbelievably incredible promise to Abram as he says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Did Abram wonder, has God lost his marbles, saying, I will be a great nation? Surely he, as God, knows all too well that Sarai is barren. Well, then again, we are not that much older than my old man when he started having kids at 70, so maybe there is still hope for Sarai and I to become parents? After all, God has said twice that he will bless me, and the context makes it clear that the blessing will come through our children. And that slender thread of hope that they aren't too old just yet to start a family would have helped Abram believe God's promise. And then God continues with, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Us modern English-speaking people miss the way Abram understood the powerful promise God is making him. For the first Hebrew word for curses comes from a root that means to make light of something heavy. The second word for curse comes from a completely different Hebrew root word, meaning something along the lines of to utterly destroy. And so we need to see that God is saying to Abram, the one who disrespects you and treats you with contempt because you are obeying me, I will destroy. And with God's promised blessings ringing in Abram's ears, we read how, just as God told him to, Abram left Haran. He was 75 years old. His wife Sarai and his nephew Lot went with him, along with all their possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. In this simple, straightforward explanation of the journey, we miss comprehending the magnitude of how hard this journey would have been. Not only were they going somewhere they hadn't been before, we know from later on when Lot and Abram's servants fought over the land and water that between them they had an awful lot of animals to feed and water. So Abram was not only getting himself and Lot's family packed and ready to go, there was also all the servants and animals that needed to be prepped and made ready for the move. Therefore, Abram wouldn't have had any hope of being able to set off the next day, like I have heard in a few sermons, but clearly he set everything into motion so that everyone and everything would be ready to leave as soon as it was humanly possible. And then the journey itself would have had its own hardships and struggles, for you cannot push animals too hard or they lose condition. So it would have been a long, hard, slow slog getting to Canaan. It would have taken them somewhere between 6 to 12 months. And again, no clues as to how Abram handled the long wait between the command to leave, the hardships and dangers on the long journey to a land far, far away, the doubts and fears, the worry and stress of keeping everyone safe from robbers, feeding them all, and on the list would have went. And as he went over a hill wondering whether, are we there yet? To find out the answer is no, leading to the increasing conviction that he would never make it to Canaan. And Lot doesn't really get that much of a thought, except that he was tagging along with Abram. But both Lot and Sarai would have been important too, in the way they would have encouraged Abram when he doubted he was on the right track and actually obeying God. Or was he just following some whim of his father's? And Moses blithely sums up all this work and emotions with this major understatement. And they arrived in the land of Canaan. And what really shows Abram's belief in God's promise is how he doesn't just cross the border into Canaan and rest on his laurels, thinking, well, I've finally made it and I deserve to stop and rest now. No, for Abram then travelled through the land as far as the site of the great oak tree of Morah at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Did you, like I did, go, oh, duh, of course the Canaanites were in the land. It's Canaan. But for Moses' original audience on the threshold of entering Canaan, they understood this as an umbrella term to cover the different people groups descended from Ham's son Canaan, such as the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, etc. And it was also a timely reminder that the Canaanites of Abraham's day were very different in their behaviour and attitudes to the Canaanites they will be facing shortly when they enter God's promised land. For back then, the Canaanites were hospitable and welcomed Abram and all his possessions. The other thing I didn't realise is that Shechem is roughly in the centre of Canaan, and that the oak tree or terebinth tree may also be translated as the diviner's oak or the teachers. And so it was possibly considered by the Canaanites as a holy sanctuary to their gods. So Abram not only went to the very centre of the country, and seeing he didn't know the layout of the land, either he ended up there unintentionally, or God had led him to that very spot where the Canaanites carried out their spiritual worship practices to their false gods, which, considering God's promise to show him the land, is highly likely, as a kind of foretelling prophecy that one day the whole land will be joined together in worshipping the one true God. And did you notice that Abram didn't set about decrying their false worship practices? Instead, he was happily camping and resting there when the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So Abram built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him there. Again, we get the sense that Abram let the Canaanites do their thing to their gods, and he built an altar to the God who had called him and his father out of that false worship, to let the Canaanites know that both him and Lot worshipped a very different God. And we don't know how long Abram spent camping at the great oak tree of Morah. But in verse 8, we learn that at some point Abram left there and went toward the hills east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There Abram built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. And while us modern people don't know where Ai was, it is a hotly debated topic. We can be confident that the Israelites Moses was originally writing to did. For it is only a short time later that Joshua, after taking Jericho, as chapter 8 verse 28 describes, Joshua burned Ai and made it a permanent heap of ruins, a desolate place to this day. And so here is Abram, a stone's throw away from Ai, setting up camp. And this time, Abram doesn't wait to hear God speak to him. He immediately builds another altar to the Lord and calls out the name of the Lord. Abram is now getting the picture that communication with the God who created the world can be a two-way street. And once again, the narrative is silent on why Abram called out to God. Perhaps it was in praise for safety in all his travelling. Perhaps it was for God to provide some need he had. Or perhaps it was a bit of both. What we can be sure of is that Abram's faith in God has grown in leaps and bounds from dutiful obedience as the mantle to head to Canaan had been passed on to him, to a man who now had a growing relationship with God, where he was confident God would hear him as he called out his name. And then verse 9 shows Abram on the move again, as it tells us, then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. And the original audience understood that Abram had entered Canaan from the northern end, travelling south to its centre, and now was heading further south to the Negev. And they got how Abram, even though Sarai was still childless, was hanging on to the faint glimmer of hope that they could squeak in a child soon, before it was totally unrealistic to expect a child. And so Abram was checking out what the land was like that God had promised would one day belong to his descendants. And this is where today's reading leaves Abram. For in the next verses, Moses moves away from a bare factual narrative to a more in-depth personal version of Abram's adventures and journeys in and out of Canaan. Are you like I am, after unpacking the verses, starting to realize that while what Abram did was an awesome undertaking, but by Moses only giving the bare facts, it gives us room to try and figure out Abram's situation and what he was thinking, by putting your own personal life experience spin on it, making Abram's faith more relatable and achievable for everyday people like myself and you. And okay, I dare say, like me, you also don't have a retinue of servants and large flocks of animals to organise when God calls you. But have you had to suddenly step into someone's shoes at church because they had to move for a job or got sick and you were feeling unprepared for the responsibility God has placed on you? Then you can imagine that is how Abram felt. And if you can get yourself organised and ready to leave for another place overnight, then you too can imagine that is what Abram did. Or if you need to plan and fine-tune all the details well in advance, then you can believe that is what Abram did. For the narrative is more concerned about showing different ways people show their obedience to helping God's plan happen. And with that bigger picture of the people God used to get the family to Canaan, perhaps you can see yourself as one of the people in today's narrative who played an important role in the move from Ur to Canaan. Are you someone who identifies more with terror because you have started out obeying God's call, but for whatever reason you have been unable to go all the way? And you feel bad for not finishing what God has asked you to do. But take heart, for remember, there is no hint in the narrative of God judging terror for not continuing. The thing is that because you did obey God's call, you have completed maybe half of the task or more. as a point of reference, Haran is slightly over halfway from Ur to Canaan. Therefore, what you have managed to do makes it easier for the person who will step into your shoes to finish the task. Or maybe God has called you to be like Abram, and so you get to finish the job and also get most of the praise and glory. Therefore, before you get all puffed up at the special role God has given you, what we need to remember is that it was because of the combined journeys of Terah and Abram that the hard, long trek from Ur to Canaan was completed. Or maybe God has called you to be like Lot or Sarai and do the vitally important background, unseen work of encouraging and supporting someone who is obeying what God has commanded them to do. And last but not least in God's eyes, most people can relate to the unnamed servants who did all the hard yakka of packing up, looking after animals, and whatever other small menial tasks that needed to be done to ensure they were able to travel without fuss or drama. It was a team effort that helped firstly Terah and then Abram lead the family safely to Canaan. And so go out into your corner of the world knowing that we won't all be called to finish the job like Abram, and that God sees every one of you as being equally important. How you are all part of a team, each with its task to do, that is willingly obeying the task God has asked you to do. And therefore, God's work gets done. Amen.